It's interesting that I actually had two of the greatest adventures of the 20th century, one of them being a roadie for an original San Francisco rock band and hanging out with the Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Deads and all that. And then this accident happened, and this accident was mountain biking. I was not a gifted athlete as a child. In fact, I was 24 years old before I found any sport that I was good at, and it turned out to be riding bikes. And the way that I found that out was in 1970, I hit bottom. And you can only turn your life around when you've hit bottom. And I hit bottom because I was a pedestrian. I didn't have a car. You're screwed. So out of sheer desperation, and just because hitchhiking was too slow, I got a it was really junk bike, a Schwinn Varsity in terrible condition. And I got on that thing. It was 24 years old, the first time I got on a 10-speed bike. And the first day that I rode that bike, I went over the handlebars, and I got bit by a dog. And I'm thinking, this does not really look like the future. However, it turned out that's the only time I've been bit by a dog, day one. And I do remember that that dog bit me, and his owner, hearing a commotion, came out and said, "What are you doing to my dog?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to kill him, but he won't stand still." And in connection with my musical, I wouldn't call it a career, just an avocation, I met a young woman who was hanging around with the Grateful Dead, and she said, "You know, I know a guy, he's just like you, he's a bike rider, and if you ever met this guy, you guys would hit it off." And she called him Spider. Well, one day I'm riding along in San Anselmo, and there's a guy, well, he's all arms, legs, and hair, and if you were going to call a guy Spider, he looked like the guy you'd call that. And so I rode up and I said, "Are you Spider?" And he said, "Well, kind of. They call me Spidey. There's another guy called Spider, and it's complicated. But my real name's Gary." And he introduced me to his friend. He said, this is my friend Marmaduke, because I didn't know this, but cyclists all used assumed names then. And I didn't catch on. I was too late. I was using my own. But and he said, "Marmaduke plays in a band called the New Riders of the Purple Sage with Jerry Garcia. And we're headed down to the Grateful Dead office to look at cover art for the album that they just recorded." And I invoked my Sons of Champlain credentials and said, "I already know those guys, so yeah, let's go." And so about 10 or 15 minutes after I met those guys, I was sitting on the third floor of the Grateful Dead office, and with Gary and this guy Marmaduke. His real name is John Collins Dawson III. And the bass player, his name is Dave Torbert. Four of us in this room. Two guys in the band and two bike riders picked up off the street. And there's all this artwork on this table, and these guys are playing the record, which was great. And they're saying, "What do you think of this picture?" And I'm thinking, I'm looking at Gary. I don't know this guy either. I just met him. And I'm like, "Why do you care what I think about this? It's your album." And, but Gary and I gave our opinions. And about a month later, the album came out, and those pictures we pointed to are the cover. And the way it worked was that decision, somebody had been tasked with that decision. You got to choose the cover art, and apparently two guys from the band said, "Okay, we'll do it." And on the way, they rounded up a couple of bike riders that apparently got a vote. So Gary and I became friends, and Gary, the New Riders were hot then. They were riding this album, and Gary started house sitting for the guitar player Marmaduke, and right there on the bike path. So I got in the habit of, when I would go out for a bike ride, I'd stop and collect Gary, and we'd go together. And in Marin County in 1970, there were, only a handful of really hardcore cyclists. The bike boom had not hit, and Gary was the first person that I knew who could could teach me about cycling. He had been racing since he was about 13 or 14. He was an excellent cyclist, and I just absorbed knowledge from him. He knows more about, even to this day. Gary is an encyclopedia of bicycling and related subjects. I can't speak highly enough of his knowledge of bikes. About, I don't know, 6 or 8 months after we met, I was at the flea market buying some furniture for a house I had rented, and I ran into Gary, who had a truck, and I said, Gary, can you help me move this furniture back to my house? And he said, sure, let's throw it in the truck. So we throw this furniture in his truck. It was a table and some chairs, and a week goes by. The guy stole my table and chairs, my $25 table and chairs. But no, eventually he shows up, and we're bringing the stuff in the house, and he's looking around the house. He says, wow, who lives here with you? And I go, what? Nobody right now. He said, you need a roommate? Okay, well, obviously we became roommates. And our house was kind of unique in that most houses don't use the bikes hanging from the ceiling as a room divider, but that's the decor that we had there. We also had, in the basement of this house, we had a stash of bikes, and we had a boxer's speed bag, you know, and we had a set of bicycle rollers, and we would go in our basement, we'd work out with the speed bag and the rollers, but both of those things made a lot of noise. And we had a stereo that we put a speaker in the basement so we could put some tunes on while we did this stuff. And I can just say this was the noisiest workout anyone ever heard. Nobody was ever in doubt when the guys were working out in the basement. The whole neighborhood knew. Now, about this time, I had been inspired by Gary, who had been racing bikes for 8 or 9 years, even though he's just 20 or 21 at the time. I wanted to race my bike. I was feeling like, wow, I really want to find out what this bike racing stuff is about. But it turned out that, this is what I wrote in the book, that bike racing at the time was burdened with more rules than baseball. And some of the rules were you had to wear white socks, you had to wear black shorts. And one other rule that was more crucial was that you had to be a member of an accredited club, and I wasn't. There was one club in Marin County at the time, and it was Marin cyclists, all of whom were mostly 10 to 20 years older than myself and my friends, and we didn't really consider that an option. So we formed a club, and the mechanics of forming a bike club are kind of interesting, but they're not much different from any other club, so I'll leave them out. But what happened is that the younger element of cyclists in Marin County gravitated toward our club, which we called Velo Club Tamalpais. And okay, and now I could race my bike, and that's how I found out that I was really not very good at it, but I'll soon going to find it out. So, for the record, I was not a very good bike racer, but I liked it. And I got to be president of the club, too. But what we noticed, and certainly it's obvious when you think about it, that Gary and I were living in this house where he had a vehicle, but almost all of our local errands were conducted on 2 wheels. And you find out very quickly that your Italian road race bike is good for only one thing, and that's not shopping for groceries. And because it's delicate, it's expensive, you can't really leave it outside there very long. And so, mostly because Gary had a collection of old bikes and old bike parts, Gary and I put together a couple of just one-speed coaster brake clunker bikes, you'd call them now, or cruisers. And in that respect, we joined every surfer in Laguna Beach and a lot of college students who had done the same thing. We were at that time no different from tens of thousands of other young people who had just gotten some cheap bikes for local transportation. And one day, this friend of ours said, throw the bikes in the truck, bring them up, and let's take them out on a trail. And that trail was at a place called Tamarancho. Now, Tamarancho was a Boy Scout camp where my brother Jim, who's in the audience tonight, and I camped as Boy Scouts. And I was very familiar with the area. I'd hiked all over it. I'd been a Boy Scout. We played these incredible games of capture the flag on hundreds of acres of this prime land. So anyway, my friend said, let's take the bikes out on the trail. Well, the guy with the truck, me and Gary, that's 3 people. We had 2 bikes. But it was just a lark. It wasn't important. And so what we did was we rode these bikes out this trail, very unskilled. We're barely staying on the trail. And whoever wasn't on the bike was running along next to the guys with the bike. I mean, it's nothing serious anyway. So I don't know how far we went. We'd trade off. The runner would get the bike and somebody else would run. We went a couple of miles until it got pretty steep, and we don't want to keep going up this steep hill, so we stopped and we turned around. And kind of an epiphany there, because I found out right then that even if you're riding a bike that is nothing but junk, falling apart under you is still more fun than chasing the guy who's riding that bike. And he is laughing his ass off because you're chasing and he's coasting. But anyway, real epiphany that, wow, downhill is kind of fun. We started going on regular rides with our 1-speeds. I mean, we hadn't really modified the bikes at all, although really in short order, we all got the idea that maybe a front brake was a good idea because your coaster brake's a little bit unreliable. And one day, my friend, his name is Fred, he's deceased now, but he took me on a ride on his motorcycle, and we found this really steep hill. We rode up this hill on his motorcycle, and we rode around for a while and came back down it. And he said, that'd be a good place to take our bikes. So one summer day, we took our bikes and we made this circuit on this dirt road. And of course, the bikes are 1-speed, so anytime you come to a hill, you're pushing them. And it was no big deal. It was not a big deal to push your bike. You're walking along, talking to your friend. And when you get on the downhill, well, you have a lot of fun, and then maybe you push up the next hill. But we finished going down this hill, it's 2 miles, and it's a famous place now. We call it repack. And the reason it's repack is because one trip down it cooked your coaster brake to the point where you had to take that thing apart, repack it with grease. And of course, that's become almost part of the lore, that's why it's repack. But we started, going on regular rides, and there started to be a fairly good-sized crew going on the rides. Well, in December 1974, there was a race in Mill Valley, a cyclocross race. Now, some of you know what that is. That's basically a cross-country race on lightweight 10-speed type bikes. They're built for that purpose, but they look essentially just like a road bike. And we went down to this race mostly because Gary was in it, and it was close by, and it's a bike race, and hey, we're all bike racers. So I didn't participate myself. Gary was in it, and my friend Joe Breeze was in it. And we saw these guys there. They had come up from Cupertino, and they had balloon tire bikes too. And their balloon tire bikes had something we didn't, which was a derailleur and 5 gears on the back. And they had thumb shifters on the handlebars. And, well, they got our attention completely. And the great thing about a bike, from a mechanical standpoint, is there's very little that's hidden. If you look at it and you understand the mechanical aspects, you don't need to be shown or taught or anything. We knew what a derailleur was, and we could see how they had put them on there. The problem with a derailleur is that you can't use a coaster brake on it anymore. You have to be able to freewheel. So they had found these drum brakes that were tandem brakes, and they weigh a ton, but they did the job. And these guys on these heavy 26-inch cruisers with all the extras, well, they were beyond non-competitive. These guys were in so far over their head, they were done in one lap, because it was a different kind of thing than they were prepared for. They were not real cyclists. They were just, you know, guys with bikes. And there is a difference. But they did inspire us. And a few months later, Gary comes home from the flea market, and he has bought the remains of a broken down tandem. He only wanted one part of that tandem. That was this enormous drum brake rear hub. And in the living room there that evening, he built his first 5-speed clunker wheel. And he ran out of spokes of the right length. And so he found some other spokes, and he just bent them to the right length, you know, and used them anyway, you know, because, hey, who wants to wait till tomorrow and go to the bike store and get 3 spokes? You know, you're not going to do that. So, and it really emblematic of the makeshift aspect of the whole deal. But anyway, he put that drum brake on the back of his clunker bike, and it required quite a bit of experimentation to make it all work, because these bikes are really not compatible with that. But we got it together, and mostly he got it together, and we went for a ride, and we started up the hill, and even on a 50 or 60 pound bike, Gary just rides right away from everyone. Well, in the matter of just a few months, these conversions were taking place all over Marin, because everyone in our immediate crowd of maybe a dozen or 2 dozen people saw the future, and so within a year or so, there were a couple of dozen of us riding around on what are now called clunkers, which is essentially a 30s Schwinn modified with 5 speeds and generally drum brakes. These rides started to get, well attended. And the way a ride works out, and I know every one of you knows this, a mountain bike ride, is you ride uphill till you get to the top of something. You don't just leave, you stop, you hang out, you throw the frisbee, you picnic, you have other recreational activities, whatever. Use your imagination. But anyway, when it comes time to turn it around, you don't have to say, this is a race. You don't have to tell anyone. They already know. And so every ride, and because Fairfax is, of course, at the bottom of the hill, it's not the top, every ride back into Fairfax turned into a de facto race. And one thing about an event like that with, whatever, 8 or 10 testosterone-charged young men on a narrow dirt road, whoever's biggest is going to win. And there was one guy who was, well, in any crowd, there's going to be somebody who's the biggest, and there was, and he was a guy who didn't mind riding you off the edge of the road if it helped him. So we started thinking about a competition, and we realized that the clock is really the fairest way to do this. And in 1976, October 21st, if you care, a few of us rounded up some crude timing equipment, and we went to the top of our hill repack, and we had a timed downhill. Okay. Now, it's interesting that the whole purpose of that race, that one race, was to settle essentially forever which one of this group is the fastest rider. But there are a couple of things that you learn when you do this. First, you only satisfy you only answer that question till the next event, because everybody who didn't win wants a shot at the champ. And second, we found out that riding downhill on a dirt road that you have absolutely to yourself is one of the biggest thrills that you could ever find in life. I mean, it's right up there with skydiving or surfing or anything else adrenaline-charged sport. And the racing, just being there was the object, really. And so this race that was going to be one time, suddenly everybody wants to be there, and everybody who wasn't in the last one wants to be in the next one. And I went out and purchased a couple of the first generation of digital stopwatches. They timed to 1/100 of a second, and And with that kind of accurate timing, I became the de facto promoter, and so this race series became very popular. Within a month of our first race, I think on our fourth or fifth race, we had guys coming from Berkeley across the bay. I don't even know how they found out about this, but everyone who had even the slightest interest in riding fat tires downhill found us and came and joined us. And it just became central to many of our lives, and I call it a goofy hobby shared by a couple of dozen people, and really that does describe it, but a goofy hobby that inspires passion beyond anything else we'd ever felt. You know, I mean, I don't know how many of you have ever raced downhill, but boy, is that ever a thrill. And we couldn't get enough of it. And so it became a regular event, and I was the promoter. And in the second year we did that, we had the awards banquet. We had the what we called the Clunker Awards banquet, and I put on this faux banquet, and we gave out fancy awards for, you know, best dressed, fastest dog, you know, whatever. And, you know, you choose the recipients, and then you figure out what you're going to give them an award for. But we had a wonderful event, and it really cemented our community. One of the problems that I found with riding these old bikes was that they didn't last very long under me, and I would go through an old Schwinn that is now so super collectible. I'd go through one in about 4 or 5 months, and that's why they're so collectible. I made them rarer. But at some point in 1976, I asked a friend named Craig Mitchell, did he think he could do a chromoly version of one of these bikes? I wanted a frame builder to build me a frame, and I'm not a frame builder, but my friend Craig Mitchell was, and he built a frame. And it's probably the first attempt at a modern mountain bike frame. Unfortunately, I wasn't happy with it. I sold it back to Craig, and a few months later, I ran into Joe Breeze, just riding his bike, and I'm riding my bike, and I said, Joe, I knew that he could build a bike frame. He'd taken the Eisentraut course. He built a couple of frames for some of the club members, and I said, Joe, what would it take to get you to build me a frame for the off-road? And he thought about it, and he named he put a number on it, and I had $300 in my pocket at the moment. I put it in his hand, and I said, whenever. And the great thing about Joe, and not too many of you know him, I'm sure, but Joe, when he accepts an obligation, you can bet that it will be done, and it will be done months later than you expected it. So it was about 8 months before I saw that bike. But Joe had, when you build a road bike, and Joe built a couple of road bikes, when you build a road bike, at the time, you could take advantage of, 80 years of lore that had been built up about how you build these bikes. But Joe was working in uncharted territory, so being the careful guy that he is, he sat at the drawing board, and he just worked on the paper part for a month or two. While he was doing that, everybody else in our small crowd knew that I had engaged him to do this, and he took 8 more orders. And so he eventually built 10 bikes, and he kept the first one, and I got the second one. And I certainly consider those bikes that Joe built to be the very first modern mountain bikes. For one thing, they were brand new. There was nothing on them that was found or, made to work. Everything was chosen and integrated to be a real bicycle from the ground up. Everything else we'd been using, there were almost no new parts on it because it just wasn't being built. And once again, we thought, well, that's enough bikes of this kind, because how many people are going to care about this? And well, obviously, more people wanted them, and it was quite clear that Joe took a while. He could do it, but he was not going to really churn them out. And as it turned out, 1978 was the year that the first article appeared about these new bikes. And I'm going to connect this all in a second. And it was an article in the Co-Evolution Quarterly, which is an offshoot of the Whole Earth Catalog. And in that article, there was a mention of a place called Crested Butte that I had only read about. I knew it existed somewhere, but the writer suggested that the guys in Crested Butte were just like us. They had, you know, cruiser bikes, and they were riding them on the hills and so forth. And they gave an address in the article. So I called up that phone number, and I said, "Hey, you guys doing that big ride that you do out there?" And the guy said, "Oh yeah, we're doing it." Well, in fact, unlike our event, which was a regular series and repeated, they had this one ride in Crested Butte in 1976, just on a lark. They'd ridden into Aspen, and most of those bikes had traveled over the top of Pearl Pass in a pickup truck. They were not like us. But some guys called you from 1,000 miles away. You can say yeah to anything. You won't have to defend that yes. But on the basis of that phone call, 5 of us saddled up and went out to Colorado. And we showed up in town. It must have been amazing for them, because these guys they were like us 5 years earlier with just junk bikes and using them for town bikes. And we rolled into town with these hand-built bikes, and a woman, Wendy Craig, who was one of the regular parts of our crew. She took most of the photographs in my book. And we kind of embarrassed these guys, because we came 1,000 miles for your ride, and they were going to ride. Now we got to do it. Wow. And I got a girl, too. And we really got to do it. And I remember that the days leading up to the actual ride were very entertaining, because Joe and Gary and I had, of course, had a lot of experience in working on these kind of bikes. And these guys, every one of them riding something we wouldn't even consider. And so the 3 of us spent a couple of days doing everything we could to get these guys' bikes into some kind of useful condition. And I'm not sure we even accomplished that. But anyway, we rode out of town, 13 of us, in September 78, I'm sorry. And it became an iconic moment in the history of mountain biking. There's a photograph that's been reproduced all over the world of the 13 people standing at the top of Pearl Pass with mostly very unlikely looking cycling equipment. And then the ride down from Pearl Pass, well, I'm not sure how, it's 7 or 8 miles of rocks that vary between the sizes of, well, you say cantaloupes were the small ones, watermelons are the mediums, and bathtubs are the big ones, you know. And it's a pretty brutal ride. Gary got to the bottom of that ride, that very, very gnarly ride, rides into Aspen, and a kid says, "Hey, do a wheelie." Well, Gary's eager to oblige, pulls it up and breaks the handlebar right off of his 1937 Schwinn. And at that point, Gary realized, I might have to join these guys on custom bikes, you know. And, the difference being that, of course, he knew that it was going to take him 8 or 9 months if he went through Joe. Gary hedged his bet. He called 2 different frame builders. He called a guy named Jeffrey Richmond, who worked out of Sonoma County, and a guy named Tom Ritchie, who lived down in Palo Alto. And Gary ordered 2 bikes from each of these guys and figured he'd get the first one, whoever delivered first. Well, anyone who knows anything about Tom Ritchie knows who delivered first. Tom Ritchie that guy can whip out a bike between bites of his lunch. I'm telling you, that guy can make bikes faster than anyone, and the bikes come out beautiful. Anyway, bottom line, Gary winds up with a bike, 1979, and he's caught up with me on my breezer and the few other people that have breezers, and once again, we feel that the world supply of mountain bikes is now saturated. And who else is going to want one of these? And I don't know, a month or two later, Gary calls me and he said, Charlie, got to come over to the house. Tom made more bikes. Okay, so, well, what happened is that Tom had gotten interested in the project because Tom himself was an off-road rider, but he rode a different style of bike out on the trails. But he was inspired to build 9 more of these bikes for 26-inch wheels. And then he found out that in Palo Alto, there was no market. Marin County was the market, Palo Alto was not the market. So these bikes are just sitting around. Finally, he called Gary and said, look, Gary, if I just front you the bikes, see if you can find your enough friends to sell these bikes to, and then pay me for the frames. And Gary calls me and says, come on over, and I come over and he opens the trunk of his car, and I mean, these are as beautiful as any Italian race bikes ever, and there's 9 of them. And he asked me a question that certainly has a lot of consequences to it. He said, hey Charlie, you want to help me sell these bikes? How many people's lives pivot on a question like that? But mine took a very, very sharp turn at that point. And I said, oh yeah. Not knowing that that was really going to change my life, but because once again we thought 9 of these bikes, hey man, that's going to double the world's supply. You know, it might be hard to get rid of. And at the time, of course, we didn't have a business. We just had bikes. And in order to put wheels on these bikes, all we have is frames. We had to go down to the bike shop, buy some hubs, some spokes, some rims, go home, and we're buying the stuff retail to put these bikes together, right at the bike shop. And if we made no money at all, just the cost of the bike, $1,300 for this bike. That's with no profit. And not only that, you had to give us the money first, because we didn't have the money to go down there and buy all that stuff. So I can say this right now, that Gary Fisher and I did not look like the solid citizens we do now. That's a joke. Anyway, thank you. You had to give these 2 crazy-looking hippies $1,300, and then you're going to wait a month because it took us a while to put all this stuff together. There were not that many people willing to do that, but a few were. One of them being my uncle, who, he traveled all over the world at the time, and he had the money, and he bought one of those bikes. We sold those bikes, and turned out that more people wanted them. And so Gary and I, within a few months, we rented a garage, and we thought of a name for ourselves. Let's call ourselves Mountain Bikes. That's a really catchy name. And hey, let's file for a trademark on that, and which we did. Now, at the time, there were 2 trademark attorneys in Marin County.